This is the history of Australia. Humans are believed to have arrived in Australia 50,000 to 65,000 years ago. The island of Tasmania was connected to mainland Australia until 14,000 years ago, when sea levels were rising. Now to the real history. Make sure to subscribe. There was a theory of Portuguese discovery in the 1520s, but it lacks evidence. The Dutch East India Company ship, captained by William Janzoon, made the first European landing in Australia in 1606. But that same year, a Spanish expedition sailing in nearby waters and led by Portuguese people landed in the New Hebrides and named the land Australia del Espiritu Santo in honor of the Queen of Austria. The Dutch in 1616 made another expedition to Australia and landed on an island off the coast of Western Australia. The Dutch kept sending ships to look at Australia and mapped out about the entire continent except for the east, and then never committed to making a full-scale colony. The first English expedition in 1688 and 1699 were in New Holland, and published influential descriptions of the Aboriginal people. In 1769, James Cook, on an expedition across the Pacific, wanted to go to the supposed southern continent, but they never found it. But Cook decided to survey the east coast of New Holland, which was the only major part to not be charted by Dutch navigators. In April 1770, Cook charted the coast fully and took possession of the east coast. The French were late to the party and were the first party to encounter the indigenous Tasmanians and to kill one of them. And they also claimed Western Australia but never followed up on their claim. No country wanted to try actually colonizing the continent except for Britain, and the government decided to establish a colony at Botany Bay, modern New South Wales. The American Revolutionary War saw Britain lose most of North America and wanted replacement territories. Britain needed a place to send convicts, and that eventually led to Australia, so that's Botany Bay. Britain made the territory of New South Wales, which at this time was expanded and made up more than half of the continent, and the islands surrounding. This colony was then brought by many settlers, including hundreds of convicts, and Sydney was renamed. Sydney was founded around this time, from and do with it as its last name. Soon the Napoleonic Wars started and ended, which meant that there were thousands of convicts in Great Britain that were sent to Australia, nearly quadrupling the population, and the population stopped being only around the Sydney metroplex. The New South Wales colony expanded and controlled every modern territory except for Western Australia. The settlement of Melbourne was established in 1837, and soon tens of thousands were moving there, and 5 million sheep. Because of this, the territory separated from NSW and became the colony of Victoria. In 1826, some British people didn't want France to get Western Australia, so the British quickly took the land and now controlled all of the continent. Perth was the only city basically in Western Australia, and Western Australia became its own colony, and it was the first convict-free. South Australia was established in 1836 and was a privately financed settlement-based colony which was little cost to the main British government, and Adelaide was made. Queensland was made as a secondly punishment to convicts centered around Brisbane, and were soon let free for the public. Between 1788 and 1868, there were over 160,000 convicts in Australia. In the early 1800s, the continent wasn't explored too much, so some people went out to explore most nooks and crannies like the Australian Alps. In the late 1800s, the colonies got semi-self-governments. All of the colonies in March 1900 voted to join into an Australian federation, and the government of Australia was proclaimed on January 1st, 1901. Funny enough, Australia's de facto Independence Day wasn't when Australia got unified or got independence from the United Kingdom, but it was when British explorers founded the colony of NSW in the 1700s. In the early 1900s, the Australian economy and population was growing rapidly, and in World War I, Britain required its colonies to send troops, and Australia, during an election, sent 20,000 troops. After the Russian Revolution, the few socialists in Australia formed the Communist Party of Australia, which did get some influence in the country, but was never given its chances to shine, thankfully. World War II was about the same as World War I for Australia, except they had to fight Japan a bit as well, because Japan invaded their part of New Guinea, which was the Papua province of Australia. After World War II, the population of the continent was 7 million, so they needed to repopulate. They made the capital city into a brand new city called Canberra in New South Wales, and it became its own territory, the Australian Capital Territory, separate from New South Wales. Australia allied with the United States around the Korean War time. There wasn't, there really isn't much else to say about Australia because the rest is just nothing interesting and just economy stuff. But Australia nowadays is the seventh biggest country in the world, about 7.6 million square kilometers of land, 26 million people live there, and an economy of over 1.5 trillion US dollars. And they still have their not very good flag, but hopefully that changes. So that is it for the history of Australia, except it's not. I saved one last thing. The last thing I'm going to talk about is the Emu War. After World War I, soldiers were given land for themselves and emus kept stealing crops. So in 1932, the Australian military was tasked to kill as many emus as possible to prevent them from stealing crops, which they did kill a decent bit. That plan was a failure. The second attempt was also a failure, and the emus won the war. A country lost to a bird. But the emus were kept out of farms by barrier fencing, but it's just funny how Australia lost a war to a bird. That's all for the history of Australia.